They weren't just love letters. They were weapons, written in ink, sealed with lies, and carried across borders under the guise of affection. In the quiet chaos of the Cold War, where truth bent like light in a funhouse mirror, a young woman in Moscow began to write. To her, it was only a correspondence. To history, it became a catalyst. Each page she folded carried two stories, one of longing, the other of loyalty. And somewhere, thousands of miles away, a man in Vienna opened his heart. Unaware he was opening a door straight into the ruins of his own country's secrets. This is how the KGB transformed love into a weapon. How a handful of letters, dressed in poetry and perfume, brought down one of America's most trusted intelligence circles. Anna Volkova was, by all accounts, an unassuming figure in the intricate machinery of Soviet bureaucracy, a woman whose brilliance was veiled by her quiet demeanor, whose words carried more weight in silence than in declarations. Her presence in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs went largely unnoticed, save for her reputation among colleagues as someone who possessed an uncanny ability to listen deeply and interpret even the most delicately phrased directive. In the windowless confines of her office, the rhythmic clicking of typewriters blended with the faint scent of carbon paper, creating an atmosphere that was as much routine as it was a shield against the shifting world outside. Anna's workdays were shaped by repetition. Filing government reports, translating the calibrated language of diplomacy, copying orders, and summarizing the bureaucratic exchanges between nations. The monotony was punctuated only by small pleasures: a cup of bitter tea, the occasional joke shared with a coworker, and the rare glimpse of sunlight that found its way through the hallways of her building. She preferred the predictability of her desk to the uncertain tides of political change that were always rumored but never confirmed within the ministry's high walls. Everything changed one Tuesday afternoon, when a letter, misaddressed perhaps or perhaps placed intentionally, found its way to Anna's office. The envelope bore foreign marks: Vienna, Austria. Inside, Anna found a polite apology from Mark Ellison, an American diplomat stationed in Europe, regarding a minor mistake in a trade communique. The note was brief, formal, and unremarkable in tone, yet it held the unmistakable trace of vulnerability, a momentary lapse in the rigid world of protocol. Anna took her time with the response. She translated Mark's apology with precision, acknowledging both the mistake and his candor. Her reply was respectful, courteous, and professional, but in the margins she allowed a little warmth, an understated wit that suggested she understood the humor within bureaucratic blunders. For Mark, the arrival of Anna's letter in Vienna was unexpected, the start of an exchange that quickly moved beyond formality and into something more personal. The gradual unfolding of their correspondence was marked by restraint. At first, the letters flowed with careful jokes about the peculiarities of language and translation, reflections on the nature of diplomacy, and shared anecdotes about growing up in distant countries. Anna wrote about her childhood in Moscow, the snowy winters, the babushkas who ruled her neighborhood with kindness and sharp tongues. Mark responded with stories of Vienna's gardens, its centuries-old architecture, and the comforting rhythm of classical music that filled the city's air. As the weeks progressed, formality softened into a gentle flirtation. Anna sent Mark short poems, sometimes her own, sometimes translated works of Russian writers who leaned into themes of longing and distance. Mark reciprocated by enclosing pressed violets from Vienna's gardens, delicate, fragrant tokens that made Anna's heart skip when she lifted them from his letters. Their conversations expanded to include discussions of philosophy, politics, and dreams for the future, with each page revealing a little more of who they were beneath their public roles. Anna confided her favorite quotes from Chekhov, poignant lines about the complexities of human nature and the search for meaning in daily life. Mark responded in kind, sharing passages from Rilke and Wilde, writers whose work had comforted him during his own lonely moments. The relationship that blossomed was marked by respect, curiosity, and an understated tenderness, making it both innocent and exhilarating. Yet within Moscow, nothing could remain untouched by the ever-watchful gaze of the state. Anna's correspondence was studied, every envelope scrutinized, every stamp and curl of handwriting evaluated by men accustomed to seeing intrigue in the most innocuous gestures. The world around her was saturated with suspicion, governed by the rules of a society convinced that nothing, especially not personal affection, could exist apart from political intent. Through layers of bureaucratic oversight, Anna's letters began passing through hands that smelled faintly of tobacco, a reminder of the sleepless vigilance that pervaded her world. In the shadows behind the ministry doors, officials weighed the risk and reward of each exchange. What to Anna was an expression of sentiment soon became an opportunity. Her words, parsed for evidence, began to serve purposes she never intended. Mark, for his part, remained blissfully unaware of the shifting context in which their letters traveled. His words, filled with vulnerability and hope, were transformed by the simple act of crossing a border. In Vienna, he saw Anna's correspondence as a lifeline, a bridge to understanding and companionship amid the shifting alliances that defined his diplomatic career. For him, their growing intimacy was a source of joy, an antidote to the isolation that often accompanied service abroad. The men who monitored Anna's correspondence recognized immediately that this exchange could be leveraged. Where others might have dismissed the relationship as a fleeting distraction, the agents saw the beginnings of a web, a delicate apparatus through which information could be gleaned from Mark, shaped by the emotions that made him vulnerable to suggestion. Without Anna or Mark's knowledge, the letters ceased to exist in private. Every phrase was measured, every gesture decoded, every sentiment reinterpreted in the broader context of international intrigue. This transformation, from innocent flirtation to instrument of state interest, was subtle. Neither Anna nor Mark could perceive the invisible thread that linked their correspondence to greater forces moving beneath the surface. Anna continued writing, convinced that her efforts to blend playfulness and sincerity were enriching Mark's days. Mark responded with more flowers, more poetry, more revelations about himself and the world he inhabited. In time, the exchange that had begun as a brief interaction between two strangers grew into a relationship fraught with complexity. Anna's days became invested with anticipation. Each trip to collect her mail was filled with hope, each envelope a tiny act of rebellion against the strictures of Soviet life. Mark, too, developed rituals around their correspondence, saving Anna's letters as if they held the key to a better, less isolated future. But as the web grew, so too did the unseen intervention of those who saw opportunity rather than romance. Anna's innocence was gradually replaced by subtle unease, a lingering sense that something fundamental had shifted. While she yearned for connection and understanding, the state's agenda shaped events in directions she could neither predict nor control. Their love story remains a testament to the possibilities and perils of human connection under the constraints of power. In the space between ink and intention, longing and loyalty, Anna and Mark became actors in a hidden drama, witnesses to the ways in which affection might be conscripted for purposes far larger and darker than either could imagine. Even as they traded fragments of poetry and pressed violets, the unseen hands at work redefined the meaning of every gesture, casting both Anna and Mark into roles from which neither could easily escape. What Anna understood most clearly, in the quiet depths of her office, was that love could never be entirely separate from fear or hope, nor could it remain untouched by those who wielded control over her world. Each word she penned was at once a gift and a risk. Every line she received was balm and peril entwined. The perfect love story, if ever such a thing could exist, was threaded through with longing, laden with the burdens of loyalty, and qualified always by the world in which it was written. Project Swan did not begin with dramatics, but with subtlety. Its genius lay in recognizing that, in the labyrinthine world of Cold War espionage, strength did not have to announce itself through open confrontation. Instead, the architects of the KGB's plan understood that true power resided in the emotional currents beneath the surface, in desires, memories, and the delicate trust born from human connection. The operation's first priority was to harness Anna Volkova's correspondence. In dimly lit rooms lined with red folders and under the gaze of steely-eyed supervisors, her letters were intercepted, copied, meticulously analyzed, and then reconstructed. Every phrase was weighed. Every turn of phrase was bent quietly toward extraction. Anna's original warmth became, in the hands of agents, the means by which secrets would be coaxed from an unsuspecting target halfway across Europe. The method was psychological, not direct. Where brute force might bring resistance, gentle inquiry and the illusion of safety could draw out information without struggle. Anna's casual questions, crafted by operatives who understood loneliness and longing, became veiled requests for intelligence. "What keeps you awake at night?" A phrase that sounded like concern was now an invitation for Mark Ellison to share details that would help map his state of mind, his worries, his vulnerabilities. "Do your colleagues ever miss home?" Seemed innocuous, but cleverly prompted responses that might hint at embassy staff turnover, schedules, and the emotional landscape of American agents in Vienna. Each answer came lightly dressed in sentiment, wrapped inside the grammar of affection, and returned through the channels the KGB meticulously watched. Mark, confident in the privacy of romantic intent, responded with his thoughts, routines, and fragments of everyday life in the Vienna embassy, believing in the safety of his growing attachment. Mark's trust became the keyhole through which the KGB could peer into the workings of America's presence in Europe. The KGB's teams of linguists and analysts did not simply collect information, they built a tapestry from it. Each letter was sorted, cross-referenced, interpreted both literally and for subtext. What might appear, on its face, as the trivial chatter of two distant lovers instead hid the treasure of trade schedules, security protocols, personal connections, and plans for diplomatic events. In these details lay the pulse of American operations. When and where meetings would occur, who exchanged what information, what anxieties swirled within embassy corridors. The process relied on a form of narrative engineering. Anna's correspondence, once innocent, was now carefully recalibrated. Operatives adjusted her phrasing so that each question would not only feel natural for Mark to answer, but would also be likely to yield specific, actionable intelligence. The transformation happened without her knowledge. All she saw was the continued exchange with Mark, unaware that the character of her words had shifted, that her letters had become instruments woven into a meticulously orchestrated strategy. Mark's responses were revealing because they felt safe. Over time, with every shared story and confession, he unwittingly provided the KGB with everything they needed to complete their patchwork of surveillance and conjecture. Operational routines came out in anecdotes. Embassy staff changes were shared as idle gossip. Even seemingly innocuous details about his day became pieces in the larger puzzle. What allowed this process to flourish was the psychological dimension. Mark believed love was the one frontier the Cold War could not conquer, the final sanctuary untouched by intrigue and deception. That belief, of course, was an illusion. The emotional vulnerability fostered by the correspondence was precisely what made the KGB's operation so effective. By the third month, Mark's letters included information that, considered individually, seemed harmless. But the KGB's analysts knew how to see the forest for the trees. By linking these small fragments together, cross-referencing with external sources, and appreciating the broader patterns, they were able to build a detailed map of American activity in Vienna and, by extension, in Europe. Every tidbit, folded in sentiment and imagination, became another thread woven into the intelligence fabric. The KGB's greatest achievement in Project Swan was not substitution for conventional means, but evolution beyond them. There were no dramatic scenes with operatives trading briefcases in alleys or high-rise chases through city streets. Instead, the struggle unfolded on the silent stage of trust, each page of correspondence a move in the hidden game. The strength of the plan lay in its invisibility. The CIA's bleeding came through words meant only for comfort and affection. Anna remained unknowingly central, a vessel for questions crafted outside her control, an agent of intent simply by the act of writing and responding. Mark, engrossed in what he believed to be the purest form of connection, became a courier of his own world's vulnerabilities. Even as the KGB rewrote her letters and nudged his thoughts in directions beneficial to their aims, both Anna and Mark clung to the belief that love transcended borders. The operation was not only a testament to the ingenuity of intelligence work, but also a commentary on the malleability of sentiment. The same language used to bridge continents and cultures became, in expert hands, a tool for unraveling the threads of an alliance. The tragedy lay in the exploitation of hope, not in its destruction. In the elegant dance that led two souls into positions they would never have chosen, rather than in overt confrontation. As the operation wore on, the KGB collected, categorized, and curated the growing trove of intelligence. Each letter was a cipher, each answer a detail that could shift larger strategies. The process was patient, relying entirely on the cumulative power of tiny revelations. Eventually, as the evidence grew, the shape of American espionage operations throughout Europe emerged, vivid, coherent, and actionable. Project Swan succeeded because it transformed intimacy into leverage, affection into access. It proved that the battlefield could, and often did, extend beyond what was seen and heard into the realm of the heart and mind, where the deepest motivations and fears shaped destinies as surely as any overt act. The slow, patient extraction of secrets was conducted not with force or intimidation, but with the gentle insistence of caring questions, the rewriting of letters, and the calculated orchestration of trust. Thus, what started as an innocent romance became an emblem of the quiet power that defined much of intelligence work in the 20th century. In the end, Mark and Anna would never know how deeply they were implicated in the delicate balance of international affairs. Their story, marked by longing and loyalty, would stand as a warning. In the contest between nations, even love can become the sharpest tool of all. As months passed, the innocence that had defined Anna's correspondence with Mark began to drift away, overtaken by the elaborate machinery of deception that had gradually coiled itself around both their lives. At first, the changes were so subtle as to be almost invisible. Anna would read copies of her own letters and find metaphors she would never have chosen, turns of phrase that betrayed an unfamiliar sensibility. The neatly penned words echoed the cadence of her handwriting but not its heart, a voice unmistakably hers in form, yet rendered foreign in meaning and intent. Anna's growing unease led to moments of self-doubt, and she pondered whether exhaustion or anxiety was distorting her memory. But the truth soon became impossible to ignore. The letters she supposedly sent returned to her altered, the sentiments reshaped and sharpened, the nuance replaced by probing questions and curious patterns. She realized she had become less an author than a conduit. The state had reached into her private world and made it alien, turning her words into signals for unseen operatives to receive and reshape. It was then she understood. The correspondence had become a vessel for a purpose beyond her control, a silent operation in which her gestures and expressions could be commandeered at any moment. Her every move was noted, her routine surveilled, her apartment filled with whispers she dare not acknowledge. She encountered disruptions, strange background noises on her telephone, the lingering scent of unfamiliar cologne in her living space, the quiet certainty that every time she left her room, someone returned in her absence. Even the gentle act of receiving mail was overtaken by a heightened vigilance. Every envelope, every page, every word a possible intrusion. In this web of deception, Anna felt herself transformed, her agency overtaken, her trust exploited. She was at once an instrument of the scheme and a subject of its operation. The realization of this duality was unbearably heavy. She lived out each day with the knowledge that her most tender expressions had been captured and refashioned to serve ambitions she did not share. She was held captive not by physical constraint, but by the certainty that her own identity had been manipulated for ends she could neither define nor resist. Meanwhile, Mark in Vienna found himself drifting deeper into emotional entanglement. Anna's communications had filled the spaces in his life with purpose and promise, creating a private world in which longing and hope flourished despite external pressures. He dealt with professional anxieties and cultural isolation by returning night after night to Anna's words, their poetry, their intimate observations, their whispered reassurances. The pages grew more precious as the months wore on, becoming creased and worn from overuse, imbued with the scent and touch of hands far away. Yet as the letters changed, first in style, then in substance, Mark's devotion became almost frenetic. Faced with uncertainties in the script, shifting moods in the prose, and subtle changes in her handwriting, he cast around for explanations that fit the narrative of illness or stress rather than betrayal or manipulation. In the rising silence when letters no longer arrived, Mark's response was to continue writing, confiding deeper thoughts, greater vulnerabilities, more urgent hopes onto each new page, building a ritual of confession through correspondence. The power of Mark's attachment did not go unnoticed. For the KGB, his unwavering devotion was the most potent asset in their arsenal. Seeing how Mark interpreted every note as evidence of love, every silence as a call for caring, they amplified the illusion. When Anna's role was supplanted, they produced exquisitely forged letters in her hand. The forgeries included the smallest details: intonations, references, little jokes they had learned from the correspondence's history. Mark, desperate to hold on to the connection, believed that Anna was reaching for him still. He poured his life's details into the pages. Meetings attended, gossip overheard, changes in embassy schedules and staffing. All information that seemed trivial on its own, but in the context of international affairs was quietly devastating. The flow of personal data was collected and analyzed by Moscow with increasing care. Each fragment of information, wrapped in sentiment and reassurance, allowed the KGB to paint a comprehensive picture of American diplomatic activities across Europe. Mark's faith in privacy and love became the route by which the web spread, intricate and invisible, yet impossibly strong. The true cost of the deception came on a cold morning in Vienna. After weeks of increasingly cryptic and anxious correspondence, Mark received a final envelope bearing Anna's handwriting. Inside was not a declaration of devotion, nor a poem or a joke, but a simple and chilling sentence. "They are watching us. Burn everything." The meaning was unmistakable: a warning, a plea, or perhaps the last gesture of sabotage from someone who saw everything slipping away. By dawn, Vienna was no longer quiet. The city's mornings, usually slow and contemplative, shattered into urgency as federal agents arrived at Mark's door. His life, defined by service and loyalty, by affection and trust, unspooled in moments. Every letter, every confession, every routine had become evidence. Pages annotated in Russian, stamped, interpreted, and catalogued by those he had never met. The world he thought he had inhabited, one of quiet defiance and secret affection, transformed abruptly into a stage for forces he could not control. As officials took possession of hundreds of exchanged pages, he realized that he had been undone by the very words he believed protected him. His story, diplomat, lover, idealist, was forever changed. Anna, for her part, remained framed in the complexities she had never chosen. Her every word, gesture, and hope had become subsumed by an operation whose scale she could barely conceive. She had been rendered simultaneously an agent of change and a captive to ambition, a participant and a target, a woman whose love had become her greatest risk. In Moscow, as in Vienna, the consequences lingered. The web of deception expanded until all distinctions between truth, affection, and manipulation collapsed into a silence too deep for words. Their story endures as a reminder that in the contest between nations, the boundaries between private hope and public intrigue are easily lost. The web of deception, spun quietly and with extraordinary patience, extended beyond Anna and Mark to shape the destinies of those whose lives intersected with theirs. It was not confined to rooms or to pages. It was the air itself, invisible, weightless, inescapable, marking its subjects forever. The revelation came as a shock. For Mark Ellison, the quiet unraveling of his world began in a stark interrogation room, far removed from the intimacy and warmth that had marked his correspondence with Anna. The sense of disorientation was profound. The letters that had served as his sanctuary, pieces of personal history and affection, were now set before him as evidence. The federal agents handled the pages with clinical precision, and Mark observed how each word, each line of poetry, each metaphor, had been subjected to intense scrutiny. Annotated with Russian translations and stamped with the emblem of KGB analysis, his confessions had transformed into weapons, no longer privately cherished but catalogued as artifacts in a larger drama. As the agents continued their investigation, the scope of the operation was revealed to Mark. Every metaphor he had used to convey his emotions, every paragraph crafted in moments of vulnerability, had been ruthlessly cross-referenced against reports of leaks within the embassy. The FBI's methodical approach left little doubt. What Mark perceived as harmless exchanges were, in truth, conduits for intelligence. Bits of meeting schedules, staff changes, and operational rumors, woven delicately into the narrative of longing, had been siphoned into the hands of those intent on mapping the entirety of American strategy in Europe. The reality of his role weighed heavily. Mark realized, with pain and regret, that he had served as a courier for his own demise. His hopes and affections, transmuted into data and surveillance, had provided the very insights that allowed the web of deception to flourish. More devastating was his realization that he had been thoroughly outmaneuvered. Not through force, but through the subtle exploitation of trust and psychological vulnerability. To his superiors, Mark was an object lesson, a symbol for the dangers inherent in unchecked sentiment. To the KGB, whose own files framed him as a useful but ultimately replaceable asset, he was just another case of an operative undone by the intricacies of human connection. From a historical vantage, Mark's ordeal was one among many in the clandestine warfare that defined the Cold War. Diplomats were trained to anticipate threats from spies, adversaries, and provocateurs. Yet no training could fully prepare one for the sensation of betrayal through love, a method so intimate that its consequences echoed not only in the halls of intelligence but in the hearts of those involved. Mark's reputation, his relationships, and his own sense of self were now in question, tested by the demands of a world where trust had become the rarest commodity. Anna faced her reckoning far away in Moscow, under circumstances just as cruel yet fundamentally distinct. The weight of accusation fell on her with chilling finality. Dragged into interrogation halls behind the ministry's doors, the contrast to her previous life, the comfort of her desk, the soft click of typewriters, the laughter of friends was stark. The halls smelled of iron and old fear, a place designed not just to expose secrets but to unravel resolve. Throughout the rigorous questioning, Anna pleaded her innocence. Her appeals were genuine, rooted in incomprehension, in the certainty that her intentions had never strayed toward espionage. She insisted she had been swept along by forces she neither controlled nor understood. The interrogators, however, were unmoved. In their eyes, accidents did not happen in matters of state security. There was only intent, only will. Anna's every protest was met with suspicion, every emotion cast as a possible strategy. It did not matter that she had not been the mastermind nor the architect of deception. Her correspondence became emblematic. In the files of the ministry, Anna was labeled a risk, a person whose life and loyalty could no longer be trusted. The verdict, delivered without ceremony or public notice, descended into silent finality. Anna disappeared from official records. There was no trial, no judgment in the public eye, and no grave to mark her absence. The only trace that endured was the silence carved into her personnel file, a summary of lost potential and a warning to others. Project Swan, as the operation was known by its creators, was deemed a remarkable success. The true scale of its achievement became apparent only when the dust settled. 13 American operatives compromised across Europe, their networks mapped, their operations neutralized. The genesis of this outcome was traced, at its core, to the romance of two individuals whose longing and loneliness had inadvertently supplied the architecture for espionage on an unprecedented scale. The consequences spread far beyond Anna and Mark. Embassies reeled from the revelation, protocols were revised, and new barriers were erected against personal correspondence and unsanctioned communication. The case reverberated through the intelligence community and diplomatic circles, as a powerful reminder that the tender currents of human connection, when shaped by external intent, could alter the course of statecraft as surely as any official directive. For those who followed the story, the lessons were clear but not comforting. Trust, once lost, was difficult to regain. The effort to balance the emotional needs of individuals against the relentless demands of power and security would persist for generations. Anna and Mark's fates became parables recounted not just in training sessions and intelligence briefings, but in whispered conversations between diplomats and writers, each wondering whether the lines between love and loyalty might ever be safely navigated. In the final accounting, both were shadows cast by events larger than themselves. Mark, a figure haunted by regret and the knowledge that every word penned had contributed to the unraveling of secrets he swore to protect. Anna, a presence erased not simply by bureaucracy, but by the certainty that her honest affection had been twisted into something she could neither predict nor control. their destinies intertwined in the records of Project Swan, serving as testimony to the enduring complexity and vulnerability of human experience in the face of unseen ambitions. Yet even in absence, love's influence lingered as echo. The romance that began in poetry and hope and ended in surveillance and silence remains a compelling chapter in the annals of Cold War history, a reminder that the greatest struggles sometimes play out not in battlegrounds, but within the depths of longing and trust. The victory of Project Swan was measured not just in classified files and compromised operations, but in the hearts forever shaped by the hidden war fought through words, memory, and desire. With the passing of years, the legacy of Project Swan faded from daily memory but endured in shadowy places. Archival boxes, whispered histories, and the quiet lives of those who once played their parts upon the stage of great intrigue. The love letters, which had once fluttered between Moscow and Vienna filled with intimacy, longing, and the invisible machinery of manipulation, were now stored in a government archive. Their journey ended in a plain, gray evidence box, a container for secrets, histories, and the residue of dreams. In the stillness of those boxes, the physical traces of the past persisted. Ink had run and pooled in ghostly shapes across fragile paper, the words softened and blurred by time. Some pages retained the faint, haunting trace of perfume, a final, lingering memory of Anna's presence, echoing a moment when she believed in love as a refuge from loneliness and suspicion. Where once those letters carried hope or discovery, they now marked endings of innocence, of connection, of certainty. For the intelligence agencies that had watched the correspondence unfold, the KGB and the CIA, the letters assumed distinct and enduring meanings. To the KGB, the collection was a testament to operational triumph, material evidence that intimacy and vulnerability could be weaponized with devastating effect. The trove of correspondence became symbolic, proof of a victory achieved through patience, subtlety, and psychological insight. Displayed in confidential circles, referenced in silent nods among elder agents, these letters reinforced the lesson that power could shape any exchange, and that the human heart itself was an open field for strategic engagement. To the CIA, the evidence box carried warnings. It stood as a somber archive of failure, a reminder of how personal narrative can serve as a conduit for compromise, how sentiment may outrun caution, and how attachment may cloud judgment amidst the thick fog of duty. Security protocols, once predicated on surveillance and suspicion alone, were revised to address the subtle risks born of affection. Lessons from Project Swan echoed in the prevention measures, training, and the careful structuring of communications for those serving abroad. The letters themselves became teaching material, red flags in the curriculum of how not to underestimate the power of connection or the possibility of betrayal by the most mundane means. For Mark Ellison, the letters would never lose their emotional and existential charge. After his release, his career and public life irreparably changed. He withdrew from the world, choosing privacy over notoriety, reflection over engagement. He vanished from official circles and avoided cameras, his existence married to a quiet, untroubled anonymity. Yet the memory of the letters, of Anna's voice transformed and ultimately departed, remained as a solemn reminder, the epitaph to an imagined love. The story had ended before it began, his feelings co-opted, and every artifact of their bond now living on as history, never as hope. What haunted Mark most was not the public unspooling of his life, nor the professional disappointments, but the way in which the most intimate parts of his soul had been used against him. The words, the confessions, and the vulnerability, all catalogued and weaponized, turning sanctuary into exposure. Years later, in an interview conducted by a young historian eager to understand the psychological toll of Cold War espionage, Mark spoke with candor and depth. "They didn't break me with torture. They broke me with love." His statement resonated through the archives and became a touchstone for those studying the strange corridors of psychological warfare. It was a summary not just of his own wounds, but of an era in which the boundaries of pain and hope were routinely blurred and manipulated. In the broader sweep of history, Project Swan's consequences seem both monumental and spectral. The Cold War, in its many theaters, Berlin, Cuba, and beyond, was marked by open conflict, ideological confrontation, and elaborate chess games between nations. Yet the lasting effects of operations like Project Swan were measured in private anguish, the subtle but profound reshaping of lives, and the enduring echo of choices made beneath the gaze of power. When the ideologies that divided the world finally collapsed, when the flags of antagonism were brought down, and when new forms of international engagement replaced old rivalries, the ghosts of the letters and their legacy lingered in the shadows. For Anna, whose voice had been taken and reshaped, whose presence became silence in official files, the aftermath was equally spectral. Her contribution, unwitting and then tragic, haunted those who dared to look back at the operation's origins. What began as hope and outreach became a catalyst for uncertainty and loss. In the aftermath, her absence spoke as powerfully as any verdict, her disappearance marking another cost in the ledger of Cold War ambition. Even so, the legacy of Project Swan teaches that the greatest battles of that era were seldom visible. Beyond the facts and figures, past the conventional stories of armored divisions and diplomatic ruptures, were the hidden wars fought in correspondence and memory. The contest was waged in longing, in the subtle interplay of need and suspicion, in heartbeats and hesitation. Human vulnerability became the final theater of operation, a space where meaning could be shaped, hope transformed, and destinies decided. Today, in the quiet places where the evidence boxes sit untouched, the letters remain, not as instruments but as reminders. They point to the enduring truth that, even in the most calculating arenas, the drama of history is ultimately written in the language of intimacy, possibility, and loss. The story of Project Swan endures as a parable, not of battlefields or devastated cities, but of the infinite, unpredictable contours of the human heart. The final twist in the saga of Project Swan emerged not in the hurried chaos of political confrontation or the tidy certainties of courtroom reckoning, but in the quiet corridors of history long after the Cold War's frost had begun to thaw. In 1992, as the Soviet Union's archives trembled briefly open to scrutiny, something peculiar was discovered by a young archivist intent on cataloging the remnants of a vanished era. Among thousands of documents, folders, and coded messages, there appeared a single envelope. Its pale paper bore the distinct marks of time, aged at the corners and sealed in a way that suggested caution and secrecy. The front of the envelope read simply, "Unsent." The intended recipient, stamped in careful script, was Vienna, Embassy of the United States. What arrested the archivist's attention, however, was the handwriting, a style unmistakably reminiscent of Anna Volkova's, the central figure in the tangled web of cross-border correspondence that defined Project Swan. Yet something was different. The slant of the letters, the rhythm of the stroke, subtly off, as if penned by a hand both familiar and estranged. Inside, the page held only 3 words, "I never stopped." The brevity was haunting, a line that invited endless interpretation. Was this a coded message, a final confession, or merely a flourish left by another hand eager to deepen the legend? The simplicity of the statement implied not surrender, but persistence, a desire or memory that outlasted the operation's end, the closing of borders, even the passage of years. Scholars and intelligence historians, drawn to the case for its blend of romance, suspense, and political artistry, debated the envelope's provenance. Some contended that Anna had managed, before her disappearance, to send a single letter undetected, a goodbye or a promise, slipped from the reach of surveillance and bureaucracy. Others argued the document was a carefully staged relic, manufactured by the KGB to keep the mystique of Project Swan alive. In this theory, Anna's distinctive handwriting was imitated, almost perfectly, but with just enough deviation to raise the specter of forgery and uncertainty. No consensus emerged. The unsent letter lingered as both artifact and enigma, an object that challenged the boundaries of documentary truth. Its ambiguity became part of the case's mythology, a detail too precise to be mere accident, too pointed to be fully explained away. The archivist, having catalogued and shared the find, noted the reverberations among researchers and former operatives, many of whom saw in the letter either the ghostly persistence of human spirit or the calculated flourishes of masterful deception. In the months and years following the discovery, peculiar rumors began to drift through Austrian intelligence circles. Someone, it was whispered, had begun receiving anonymous annual deliveries, an arrangement of pressed violets, their petals preserved in a manner dating back decades, arriving at the embassy on the anniversary of the Project Swan investigation. The act was never claimed, the sender never identified. The flowers themselves carried no note beyond the evidence of time and care, marked by their unmistakable connection to Vienna's famous gardens. For the skeptical, the story was dismissed as coincidence, the sort of tale spun by veterans and archivists eager to find meaning in the chaotic leftovers of history. Yet for others, particularly those who had lived through the uncertain years of Cold War diplomacy, the recurring violets suggested something more. If not a direct message from Anna or Mark, then perhaps an echo of the emotional life that the operation had once manipulated and consumed. The recurring gift was seen as evidence that, even when action and consequence seemed definitive, the subtler dimensions of memory and hope, acts of care, gestures of longing, could not be so easily contained. The legacy of Project Swan, and the letters that underpinned it, demonstrated an enduring truth about clandestine struggles. The outcomes do not cease when operations end and files are closed. The ripples of trust and betrayal, hope and loss, continue to wash through the lives of those touched by such episodes, long after the last report is written or the final interview conducted. In the years since 1971, the immediate effects of the operation faded into the background of diplomatic history, but the consequences stayed alive in memory, rumor, and the annual arrival of still fragrant flowers. The enigmatic unsent letter remains a symbol not only of unresolved stories, but of the strange and durable connections that outlive surveillance, suspicion, and power. It points to the endless capacity for questions about who writes, who receives, and who ultimately endures. Anna's fate, Mark's silence, the official records, all are framed now by the possibility that the greatest acts in the story were never fully public, never wholly explained. In the final reckoning, the twist reveals that the deepest struggles of the Cold War, despite their material consequences, were often shaped by whispers, gestures, and longings that refused to die. The end of correspondence did not spell the end of influence, nor did the closing of archives bring closure. Instead, love, memory, and the desire to continue emerged as driving forces beneath the surface, stubbornly immune to the neat endings preferred by official history. The web spun by Anna and Mark, woven into legend and mystery, remains unbroken, evidenced in every retold story and every violet pressed between pages. The tale ends not with certainty, but with an echo, proof that even the most carefully calculated operations can leave behind mysteries and connections too powerful and too persistent to be forgotten. The unsent letter is a final whisper in the dark, an enduring testament to the blended fate of two lonely souls whose choices, regrets, and resilient hopes continue to shape the history quietly written on human hearts. Love, it turns out, can be the deadliest spycraft of all. Because when you write to someone across enemy lines, you never know who's really reading. In the next chapter, another story of passion and betrayal. How a Soviet ballerina danced her way into the Pentagon's secrets. Until then, trust no one.